Okay, folks, so welcome. My name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture, based here at Regent's Park College. There's a permanent private hall of the University of Oxford. This is the final talk in our Hilary term series on freedom of religion and belief. Here's the thing, like you can go many a term without having one baron or a baroness in the series. And all of a sudden in one series, we now have two. So early in this term, we had Baroness Elizabeth Berridge, and today we have Lord John Alderdice, who's with us, and we are pleased that you are with us, John. John is a Northern Ireland politician and was the Speaker of the and a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the MLA for East Belfast. All this is taken from Wikipedia, by the way. So if it's entirely inaccurate, then clearly like you need to speak to your ghost writer who has been put down erroneous information. From 1998 to 2004 and 98 to 2003, respectively, Alderdice was the leader of the Alliance Party for Northern Ireland, and since 1996 has sat in the House of Lords as a Liberal Democrat. There's lots of other things that one can say, but as our hope is to have a fruitful conversation between John and our still new, I mean, at some point, obviously, like you'll stop being new, but our still new principal, which is Professor Sir Malcolm Evans. So what we're hoping to do this time, much like the start of the series when I was in conversation with Malcolm, is that I'm going to sort of kick us off with a very nice, easy, sort of fluffy kind of question. For those of us who have actually sort of sat through and enjoyed the doctoral Bible, you know that like the first question is all a bit of a gimme. It's one that like you can't possibly get wrong, although some people still made a mess of it, like I did. But anyway, so it will start with a very, very gentle gimme question, and then after that, Malcolm and John, who are clearly old friends, will be in conversation with myself, throwing in an odd question off camera from time to time. So let's start. Lord Allerdice, John, if I may. So you have a long and distinguished history of public service, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit about yourself by way of introduction. For example, how did you become interested in the question of freedom of religion and belief?
Well, I'm a son of the Irish Presbyterian nuns. My father was a Presbyterian minister. I was an elder of the Presbyterian Church for 30 years. But I discovered a problem when I was growing up as a son of the nuns. And one of the problems was that I began to feel I would not be free to follow where the Spirit led me. I would find myself cribbed-cabined and confined by what the membership of the church would like. And I was just telling Malcolm and Peter a story, but when I was a young fellow, I would read a lot of the books in my dad's study. And one of the things that we had was all the session, the minutes of the church session, going back to 1820. And I started reading through them, and month after month, you would find the same thing, which was some young couple were being brought up accused of acting up to fornication, forbidden to continue with their rights and privileges in the church. Then the next month they'd be restored to all the rights and privileges, and there'd be another young couple who were up for the same cause. And then there was a point where they tried to introduce a harmonium organ to the church, and two of the stout ladies who come down to completely ungodly instrument and put it out into the street because it was quite clear you should only sing psalms and they should be unaccompanied. That was Presbyterianism in those days. But then one day, there was an issue that took my interest given my father's position, and that was that the minister of the church had gone up to the General Assembly, voted some particular way. I can't remember what the issue was that he voted on. But when he came back, it was obviously not to the taste of the session, because they cut his stipend in half for the next 12 months until he went up and voted the right way the next time, which I think he probably did. And I thought to myself, you know, one of the dilemmas I would find is that I would be thinking to myself about faith. I would be wanting to try to explore and investigate. And I would have to be conscious all the time, was the congregation happy about this?
because the Presbyterian Church is an entirely democratic church. The members vote for the minister that they want, and he or she, there was a period of time when it was increasingly she, and now it's going back to increasingly he, but that's another story. Would come along and would be voted in, but they would be there basically with the agreement and the permission of the session, more than even the congregation as a whole. And I thought, I don't think I'm completely comfortable about that. I don't think I would be free in my religion and belief. And so I didn't. Ironically, of course, I ended up going into politics where you were even more at the mercy. And that's one of the things you notice about people and about the psychology of people. The very thing that they fear most is the thing they spent their life recreating and then landing up with it. Much later, I mean, I got involved in politics in Northern Ireland, and I was very much involved in leading the party, developing the peace process, negotiating the Good Friday Agreement. We come up to the 25th anniversary of the agreement in April of this year, of course. And then, as you said, I became the Speaker of the Assembly. But I was also very much involved in international politics, and I became the President of Liberal International, which is an organization of about 120 liberal political parties around the world. And I was, for a period of time before that, the chairman of the Human Rights Committee. And one of the things that struck me was that there was one particular article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 18, which really got very little airtime. Some people called it an orphan article, and that was on freedom of religion and belief. And I persuaded my colleagues to pick this up. And in 2018, we actually ran a campaign internationally about Article 18 in 2018. It was a kind of typical kind of political campaign in that kind of sense, but to try to persuade people to focus on this particular article and give it the thought and the airtime that it deserved. And then, you know, we did various other things, and with Peter and one or two other colleagues, we were able to get some funding from the from DFID, as it was in those days, Department for International Development, subsequently taken over by FCDO, to explore this question in a number of countries. And it's an increasingly important question and problem. And many people who would be very strong on human rights in the general sense are very, if not entirely allergic to this particular article, they're certainly rather uncertain how much they want to put weight on it. And I think that that's a very big mistake. It is a very difficult article. The more you explore it and try to implement it, it is very problematic. But it seems to me it is one that is of enormous importance, because it's dealing with things which are the ultimate conviction that people have. The most important thing for many people in their lives and in their experience. And therefore, to ignore that and go on to other things, it seems to me is a mistake. But it's a very common. So for me, Anthony, that's kind of a little bit about how I got there. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Malcolm, any immediate thoughts on what John has just said?
Well, I think the one that immediately springs to me from what you've just been saying is this. In the last few moments, you've been, reminding us that Article 18, freedom of religion and belief, Article 18 being that of the Universal Declaration, is one of the most underdeveloped of rights, although it's repeated in those terms in things like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the ECHR and others. There's nothing that ever has taken it further forward. Originally there was, there was an intent to have a special convention on freedom of religion and belief, like there was on racial discrimination, torture, rights of women, rights of children, rights of persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. But nothing has ever come to that. And given your experience, I'm wondering whether we are ever going to find, people give different reasons for that. But in the past, perhaps it was because there became complete disinterest in the early years of, let us call it, the growth of the human rights movement on the international stage. It was just not interesting enough for people to take forward. And then perhaps it's just become too difficult to take forward. So is there a spot between, on the one hand, if you like, disinterest and despair around this that will actually allow this agenda to be taken forward? And what do you think it would look like for freedom of religion and belief to be taken more seriously or more developed on the international stage?
I guess my thought about it is that we need to think a lot more about what it is we're trying to protect and enable. There are 2 or 3 elements to this. One is that, as you say, many people in the liberal progressive world, if you like, are very keen to protect freedom of belief, but they're really not at all sure that they buy into this business of religion at all, because many of them regard themselves as children of the Enlightenment, interpreted as, well, given a few generations, all of this kind of superstitious stuff will disappear. And for a period of time, it looked as though that could well be the case. What is absolutely clear now is it isn't the case. And whether you're a believer or not, if you look at the evidence, one has to say it looks as though this is a key element of the human condition. Whatever it is and whatever it's about, it's not something that's going to disappear with a bit of education. And I don't think that many people from that background have yet quite found a way of bringing that into their thinking. I don't think they find that easy to do. And it is difficult, it is challenging. The second place where it's challenging is that within the United Nations institutions, it has not been taken up as freedom for the individual to follow their faith. It has often been the protection of faiths. And so particular countries, particular governments that have an attachment to a particular approach to faith have very often said, well, this is the article that allows us to defend our faith against those who don't hold to it, by which they mean things like our creeds, our doctrines, way of behaving, our structures of authority, our liturgy, our traditions. It's those kinds of things. And I thought quite a lot about this because I was very much involved in the ecumenical movement when I was much younger in Ireland and indeed on this side of the water too. And then when I got very much involved in politics and in negotiating what ultimately became the Good Friday Agreement, I engaged very much in that. I wasn't so much involved in ecumenical activities. And then a few years ago, I got invited back to some of the things that I had been involved with when I was much younger, Ecumenical Youth Council of Europe and so on. And I was quite surprised to find that it had almost disappeared. It just didn't function anymore at all. There were all sorts of interesting reasons why that had happened. But I began to think about why it was that it had completely lost momentum. And I came to the conclusion, which may or may not be the right conclusion, but I came to the conclusion that one of the problems was there'd been a great deal of focus on things like doctrine, belief, liturgy, structures of authority, and so on. All things that these different traditions disagreed with. They all have their own bit, their own way of doing these kinds of things. And you could talk a bit about it and so, but basically nobody was prepared to give up their kind of tradition. But one thing that was common to all of these, and indeed even common to people who didn't proclaim any kind of particular faith, was what one might call religious experience. It was that experience of the transcendent. And whether you were a young person from a very evangelical background, used to those kinds of religious experiences, or whether you were a young person from a quite conservative Catholic background, for whom engaging in the liturgy took you to another place, or whether you were someone who looked up at the Alps and just found yourself moved by the extraordinary creation of which we are a part. There's something about that experience that is a common factor in all of us. And yet that was the bit that didn't get talked about. That was the bit that didn't get engaged with. And I'm kind of exploring this at the moment because one of the projects that I'm running at present is on conflict over the holy places in Jerusalem. And if you try to get even the Christians to agree with each other, it's actually quite difficult to get an agreement on fixing the floor, never mind on these bigger things. But if you acknowledge that there's something happens to us as human beings that's really important to us, it may begin to become more possible to address some of these issues of difference and divergence.
Mhm.
I don't, I'm not Panglossian enough to imagine it's going to solve all the problems and it'll all be fine. But it does seem to me that there's something in there we've got to think quite hard about if we're going to be successful in the proposition you make, which is to try to acknowledge the importance of this element of the human condition
Mhm.
in a way that people who diverge very considerably can live with together.
Yes, well, it is striking, isn't it, that the figures now show in absolute terms there are more people professing religious belief on the face of the planet than any time in recorded human history. Now, I know that's a face of a function of demographics, but it is what it is. And so it does seem strange that this is, one of the few dimensions of the human person that does seem to have got airbrushed out of thinking. And just to follow this on before we move to some of your recent work about how you feel, because you've mentioned your work within the specific human rights community, about how it engages with matters of freedom of religion and belief. Because I'm struck, as you know, I've done much work in torture prevention, working in prisons and so on around the world, where there are detailed standards for just about everything, for the size of the room, for access to medical services, to access to lawyers, to the provision of none of the main statements of standards say anything for access to spiritual services. It is just a complete non-subject. The most you may get is the odd reference to something to do with dietary standards. Yet this goes back to what you were saying about talking to the people on the ground who are actually experiencing something. When you actually go and speak to them, one of the most important things for them is access to those spiritual services, what we might call chaplaincy, counselling from those from those with whom they can share their faith in very many parts of the world. And it's always struck me as a conundrum that what we seem to have is a system in which people are projecting what they think are important onto the situation of persons and not listening to them about what they actually find important and responding to that need.
I think that's quite true. And in a whole raft of different ways and contexts, I find myself, while being very involved in issues of human rights for a long time, I mean, way back to when I was in my late teens and early 20s, when I was involved with the Human Rights Forum of the Irish Catholic Churches, and then much later, as I mentioned, internationally. But for me, the notion of human rights was a helpfully disturbing notion, rather than something that was like the Ten Commandments. It had very definite limits on it. And when you made it into simply a set of rules, you kind of lost the plot. Now, we tried in Northern Ireland for a long time to reach some kind of agreement that would end the violence. I came in, I suppose, more than anything else, with an agenda of ending the killing. And there was a lot of people from my background focused a lot on what kind of structure you would need, including what kind of human rights requirements would you need. And it all seemed a very reasonable idea, but it just didn't work. And it didn't work because the people on the extremes could always do things to literally blow apart any kind of discussion you were having. And what we came to realize was that the problem that we had wasn't that we didn't have a perfect constitution, or that we didn't have enough human rights regulation or policing. The problem we had was disturbed historic relationships between communities of people. It was a relationship problem. And so we started to explore what were the relationships that needed to be addressed. And there were lots of different ones, but the three key ones for us were between Protestant Unionists and Catholic Nationalists in the North, between people in the North and people in the South, and between Britain and Ireland. And these were deeply disturbed relationships with a long history that still impacted on people. And so the peace process was constructed to address these three sets of disturbed historic relationships. That's why there were three strands. That's why the outcome in the Good Friday Agreement was 3 sets of interlocking institutions. It was all based on addressing the relationship question. And to me, that's one of the problems. I mean, I've always been very strongly pro-European. But one of the problems, it seemed to me, was that after the Second World War, the attempt was to create new relationships between these communities, French, German, British, and others, who had disturbed relationships, expressed ultimately, of course, in the context of war. But what happened was it got turned into a structure of regulation, not an expression of relationships. And the more it became a matter of regulation, the more problematic it became, and the more it actually became a cause for difficulties in the relationships, rather than a way of resolving them. So for me, one of the problems about human rights is if you make it into a set of rules, you actually run into a lot of problems. And of course, what happened in human rights also was that it wasn't just enough to say that here are certain civil and political rights, including freedom of belief, but it also became social and economic rights, things that were completely non-justiciable. And the wider you made the whole thing, the less it could actually be implemented, and the whole thing then fell into disrepute amongst many people. So for me, this question of human rights is very important, as long as you don't make it sacred, as long as you don't make it just a question of regulation. If you say, and this is a way that we can relate better to each other, then that's great, that's fine. But it needs to be kept with this question of relationship, it seems to me.
Well, thank you. And I think that leads very nicely into the work that you're currently doing. So I was wondering if you could just tell us all a little bit about the work that you're currently doing in CRIC, it's one of these things that the acronyms and I are terrible. It's the the Centre for Resolution of Intractable Conflict.
That's right.
Yes. And that's what you've been doing for some while, based at Harris, Manchester. But then you've now got another project that you're involved in, based at Pembroke College, which is the changing character of war.
That's right.
So is there a bit of a tension between, on the one hand, trying to look at how you solve intractable conflicts, and at the other hand, focusing on war?
Well, it certainly, I think, would appear to many people that there would be. For me, there's not. Let me explain. So what we were interested in doing, there was originally a group of 4 of us got together: Harvey Whitehouse, professor of social anthropology, Scott Atran, who's also a professor of social anthropology, originally from the United States, but lived for many years in France, and a guy called Rich Davis, who was dealing with problems in the White House over the question of terrorism after 9/11. And the 4 of us had been working with the World Federation of Scientists for a while. And we decided to try to find a way of addressing this question of intractable conflict. In other words, it's not, things that are coming and going, things that they're a bit of a problem, but then they get resolved. And it was violent political conflict. And so we started doing work on it. There was some research work at all sorts of different levels, in individual psychological work, psychology of large groups, or organic investigations like functional magnetic resonance imaging of young men that were going out as suicide bombers, all sorts of stuff to try to, clarify a lot of this. And I think we made quite a lot of progress in understanding the nature of these things. But here's where you come at a problem when you're an academic who tries to make things actually happen. When you engage with the policy community, they have a completely different approach to things. And if you present your academic papers to them, you might as well give them the newspaper. They're not interested. They won't spend time focusing on it. They speak a different kind of language. It needs to be in something that they can digest quickly and turn into a slogan, or at least some kind of short paper. But academic stuff, it just doesn't translate for many of these folk. And yet what we were interested in was understanding things in order to make a difference. My agenda in studying to be a doctor wasn't just to study stuff, it was to help patients. My agenda in trying to understand the nature of conflict was to try to stop the killing in my part of the world. I wanted to create a perfect society. It's just to enable people to disagree with each other without killing each other. And so similarly, as we tried to address this, we began to think, this conflict, how does it express itself? It expresses itself in violent war, for example. And we started working with some of our colleagues, Changing Character of War, which had been set up after 9/11 to try to investigate this. Big Lever Hume Foundation funds, and Hugh Strawn set it up with a number of colleagues, and they've been working at it for some time. But what was very interesting, and might have surprised a lot of my peacenik colleagues, was that when you talk to these people, when you talk, for example, to the military guys who were involved, you said, and I find this in Northern Ireland as well, talking to military guys, they would say, look, we're professionals, we're trained to do our job, and we will do it for however long is necessary. But actually, if we end up going to war, we have failed. The purpose of the military is to stop there being a war, not just to fight the war if it actually happens. It was a bit like when I remember taking one of the senior deputy chief constables of the police service of Northern Ireland to a Liberal International Congress. And some of my colleagues were completely shocked, because when they said, well, what's the purpose of your organization? He said, I'm a police officer. My job is to protect everyone's human rights. And I went, wow, that isn't what we thought a police officer was. No, he said, that's my job. And so similarly, the job of the army is to ensure we don't have a war. If there is a war, they will fight them. They will defend us. But the whole purpose. So I began to discover that these guys and girls were thinking a lot about how to make sure we didn't get to the point of a conflict. And if you did, how you come out the other side of that conflict. And you don't do it. I mean, this was the thing at home, GOCs, Northern Ireland, General Officer Commanding Northern Ireland, would repeatedly publicly say in the 1970s and 1980s into the 1990s, we will do our job. And there is a security role, but there is no security solution. It's a political problem. And we will hold the ring for as long as is necessary. But ultimately, we will not solve the problem. The problem is a political problem. I remember working in Iraq with Martin McGuinness, who ran the IRA for years and years, invented the human bomb, did all sorts of nasty things. And of course, they were much more interested in listening to him than to me. They were much more on his kind of line of business. And he said, look, you can keep killing each other for the next 5 years or the next 25 years. But in the end, your problem is not a military problem. It's a political problem. And you're going to have to sit down and negotiate. And the sooner you sit down and negotiate, the better. Now, you have to create the context and you have to have leadership and all those kinds of things. But that's ultimately what you're trying to do. And so in engaging the Changing Character of War and currently leading the project, it's fascinating to work with people who are military people, academics, journalists, diplomats, and so on. And all of them are quite clear. You know what? We don't want more war. We want to find a way of bringing war to an end. And so the conference that we're holding this year in September is on the changing character of war and peace building. Because the kind of work that we did on building peace 20 years ago is not possible now. 20, 25 years ago, whenever I was trying to do this kind of stuff originally in Northern Ireland, the leaders, global leaders, Mandela, de Klerk, Gorbachev, Clinton, so they saw themselves as leaders because they were resolving conflicts. Now global leaders think of themselves as leaders because they're conducting conflicts. It's a different zeitgeist. It's a real problem. So how do we help people to understand it differently? Well, one of the things is if you get military people to begin to understand that they need to say to the political people, listen, none of us are going to benefit out of this. We will do our job, but don't pretend to yourself that we will solve all the problems. And I mentioned the word Federation of Scientists. We had that experience there. Nuclear physicists, Russians and Americans and British and French. And so how are we going to persuade these guys to stop the killing? Well, we'll do research on what will happen if there's a nuclear war. What exactly will happen? How many kilotons of this? How many people die of that? How long will we survive? And they took that back to the people who paid for them, which was the generals. And the generals looked at it and they said, oh my goodness, we knew it would happen to the other guys. We didn't think it would happen to us as well. And they then took it back to the politicians. And the politicians said the same thing. Oh my goodness, we didn't realize all of us would end up. That makes a different story altogether. So I think trying to help people, the vast majority of people do not want to see the destruction of themselves, their children, their grandchildren, and the rest of the world. But they sometimes don't see an alternative way of dealing with difference. And so that's the kind of agenda for myself.
Listening to your last bit, couldn't help but reflect on the famous, infamous decision of advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice in the early 1990s concerning the legality of the use of nuclear weapons. Where it basically came to the conclusion was you couldn't say in the abstract whether it was or wasn't, and it would have to be assessed after the event.
Yes, yes.
Highly unlikely that it would ever be lawful, but you couldn't rule out the possibility, and so you couldn't say with crushing certainty that it was illegal, so best back to come to the court afterwards. Doubtless there were very strong reasons why that was the advice that was given, but as advice goes, it would resonate with your views of the generals looking at well, if that's designed to help us guide our actions. Yes,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. You mentioned Nelson Mandela, and he did once say that for successful negotiations, you need to relinquish all non-negotiables. Is that really realistic?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. He's a very good man. He was a very good man. And he was very good in terms of Northern Ireland. I mean, he took an interest in our issues in a number of ways. He actually arranged for some of us from all the political parties to go out. At that time, Sinn Féin were perfectly happy to meet, but the DUP, Ian Paisley's party, wouldn't be even in the same plane as Sinn Féin. So when we arrived out, they had to create two sets of everything, even two bars, even though the DUP didn't drink. But there had to be two sets of everything. And when we went on a bus down to see the most southerly part of South Africa, nothing between you and the South Pole, we missed seeing it because the Shinners arrived first. And the DUP wouldn't get out of the bus until the Shinners had finished up. So the Shinners just hung about till it was dark. And then they got back on the bus and the rest of us got out. For goodness sake, how absurd can you be? And Mandela came in, and he had to give a speech twice, of course, because the DUP wouldn't be in the same room as Sinn Féin. In those days, different now, but in those days. And he said, well, it's very difficult solving these kinds of problems. We find it very difficult too. And we feel for you. And we'll do anything that we can to help. Anything we can. I mean, look, we've even reintroduced apartheid for the weekend just to make it possible for you to be in. And we all went, oh my goodness. It was a kind of real solar plexus hit, but done with a sense of humor that you couldn't argue with it. It was just extraordinary. So I have a huge amount of time for his perspective and things. But on this, I don't think that he's right. If we had said to, in our case at home, Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, this United Ireland stuff, forget about it, it's never going to happen. We would never have got to first base. What we had to be able to say to them was, there is another way of addressing what you want to see, other than killing people. Now, can we sit down and talk about that? And I found the same thing in talking with people like Hamas and Hezbollah and Jewish settlers and so on in the Middle East, that if you said to them, you're never going to get what you want, you didn't get to first base. If you said to them, there may be another way of addressing the problem, they say, well, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And you got into a conversation. It could be a useful conversation as long as it wasn't wrecked from outside, which it frequently was. Yes. But I think on that the things you really, really want, I don't think you can give those up. Political models that you think are a good idea, that's another question. But
that may go back to the point you were making earlier. Yes. Yeah. Correct. Yeah, and we may get onto that later. Moving on then, I'm conscious of the time, and I'm sure people in the room will have questions, and indeed online. If we go back to the work of the centre, the Crick Centre, for a moment, what would you say are the things that you feel most proud has been through that and the work that you've done through the centre?
I think that what's been most important is the work of clarifying and informing our understanding of the nature of conflict. So let me give one example. People from stable, peaceful parts of the world look at those of us in situations of conflict and they say, these people are crazy. I mean, for goodness sake, sit down and sort it out. It's not a problem. And what they don't always understand is that when you're in situations of existential threat, not only do you think in a different way, it's actually different parts of your brain that function. So one of the pieces of work that we did through this, and some research colleagues, was to look at young men, Muslims, who were going to go off to kill people. And there were a number of them in the north of Spain, around the Barcelona area, and there was a good fMRI scanner there. And we got a number of these young people to come in and ask them various kinds of questions. And then some other young people who did not have that agenda and were just, ordinary young students and so on. And what was interesting was that when you had young people who did not feel under any kind of sense of existential threat or disturbance or whatever, talking about things, the parts of the brain that lit up were those that address cost-benefit analysis, if you like, weighing up, what do I have to do here? What will the cost be in various kinds of ways? I'm going to have to work hard, but if I work hard, I'll get this kind of benefit and so on. That kind of question. But when you got these young people in who were prepared to go and kill themselves for the cause, it was different parts of their brain that lit up. Mm-hmm. It was those parts that judge things on the basis of it's right or wrong. It's not negotiable. I'm committed to this. And if you say to those young people, yeah, but it's not in your best interests, something horrible is going to happen to you. They say, so what? That's not what's important. In fact, I remember that one of the people that served in Belfast City Council with me was a fellow called Patsy McGill, who was one of the last of the hunger strikers, the IRA hunger strikers, because when he went unconscious, his mother took him off the hunger strike. And in fact, although he was with us for a while, he died quite young because his body had been so badly damaged. And Patsy was talking about the experiences and so on. And he said, sometimes the prison officers got really, really angry with us. It was on the turning protest, and hunger strike and all this kind of stuff. And they would threaten us, and they would say, what, it'll be the worst for you if you do this. And Patsy said, we just would look at them and say, now, what is it that you're going to do to me that's worse than what I'm doing to myself? And of course, there was no answer to that, because the truth was they were prepared to do terrible things to themselves, not because there was any benefit to them. They're going to die. They knew that. But because they believed it was right. And as I say, when you're in a situation of existential threat, you don't just think differently. Your brain works differently. Mm-hmm. These are really, really profoundly important issues. Now, when you're trying to persuade skeptical people who come from peaceful, stable parts of the world, our delightful friends from Norway and Sweden who go around the world trying to help people stop killing each other, and you say to them, look, we're not making this up. Have a look at these brain pictures, They go, wow, I really didn't think it was that real. Because, and we would find many people go to disturbed parts of the world and they assume that the political leaders are just playing games. They can't believe that these people really believe these things, and they do. And so I think one of the things I'm most satisfied about is that by bringing together both field work and academic reflection and technical opportunities, we've been able to demonstrate that these differences are real and they've got to be taken seriously and addressed. I mean, there's lots of other things that I could speak about, particular places where we've tried to engage in things. But I think in terms of deepening understanding, that's one of the most important things that we've been able to clarify.
Thank you. And I'm conscious in saying that of course, for many, one of the defining ideas of what religious faith is insist on what's right and what is wrong. And so one can see that misunderstood, how that could play a part.
Absolutely.
Within this.
Absolutely.
And perhaps building on that, I'm just wondering, which ways from your perspectives or your self-identity has been affected, is your faith been affected over time by what you have done and your understanding of this?
I think that coming from my background, I was very loyal to it. Whenever I was growing up, my brother and my sisters and I grew up with a kind of sense that we were part of the man's team, There were certain things you didn't do or you shouldn't do, and you went along with that because you were part of the team and there was a loyalty to that and so on. Wasn't always terribly easy, particularly when you came into your teens and you weren't that sure and so on. But as time went on, I suppose what happened for me was an opening up of this challenge. What is actually true? How much of what I have inherited is culture, which can change? How much of it is the context in which I live? And one of the things that my parents liked a great deal was to travel as much as they could afford to, which was not a lot. But we would get a tent or a motor caravan or whatever, and we would drive to North Africa. We'd drive to Helsinki and back. We'd drive to Vienna and back, or Athens and back. And at all the places that we would go through, we'd try to eat their food, understand the way they lived, go and worship in their places of worship, and try to understand. And I found I couldn't come back from that and think that the only real truth was what the people in Ballymena thought. I couldn't sense that in him. And all of these other people who were also engaged in a search, sometimes almost a desperate search for God, that they were all completely benighted. And then as I looked at the history of my own denomination, which had been people who had to, with some courage, stand out against established churches, both Catholic and Anglican, that had a very different perspective. And indeed, there was very real persecution. And then I discovered that that church had itself almost begun to act in the same way to some of its own people. That it was persecuting, that it was rigid. I almost got the kind of sense that if they'd been transported back 500 years, they would have been just as likely to be lighting the flames around the martyrs as being martyrs themselves. And I thought, I need to struggle with this. I need to try to understand it. Because otherwise I'm simply becoming part of something unhealthy and something that I do not believe is what Jesus stood for, which was kind of the important bit for me. What was I learning from him, his life, his agenda? I'm not actually seeing that as necessarily in conflict with people who were coming from other religious traditions. So I suppose for me, and I can, if just last week I wrote a response to a comment made by a guy who's Presbyterian minister in Northern Ireland, young guy, a bit of a rebel, and he was talking about how there was a particular concert he went to, and it really affected him, and the trajectory of his life was affected by that kind of, if you like, conversion kind of experience, although a different kind of conversion than some of his colleagues would have recognized. And I said, I remember that. For me, it was a conversation that I had. I was at a Boys Brigade Queen's Badge completion course, and I had this conversation. I was about 17 or 18. Had this conversation with the chaplain. And he listened to me and he drew me out a little bit. And he said, well, there's something I think you might be interested in going. He said, it's on in Liverpool. This was in 1973. It's on in Liverpool. You might be interested to go there. And I did. And the whole trajectory of my life was affected by that. And it's always made me a little careful as I engage with students here in Oxford or young people in the church, because you realize that there are things that you say and do that you may well completely forget about, but they may affect somebody else for the whole of the rest of their life and many other people beyond them. And so I've always found myself being a little conscious and cautious about what we say to young people, because it can affect them and others for good and ill in a major way.
Well, thank you. And I think that's a very good point at which to draw this to this element of the evening to a conclusion. So thank you. I'll hand back to Anthony in case there's any questions you'd like to ask, or open it up to the floor for questions.